Good day. Today, 24th May, is a day which starts with renewed efforts by some people in Washington and London and elsewhere to revive the freeze idea for the conflict in Ukraine. This appears to be based on a wide understanding, a universal understanding now in the West, that the war in Ukraine is being lost. The commander of the Swedish Armed Forces, military commander of the Swedish Armed Forces, has come forward now and has said that at the current rate of production, which the Russians can continue for a very long time, they will always be able to outproduce the West in weapons, that it would require radical changes and shifts in Western society, which are not politically possible or socio-politically possible to achieve, to reverse that. And of course, given what people like Brian Beletic and Alex Vashinin and others, myself as well, have been saying for a long time, the war is won by logistics. Inevitably, that means that the Russians, sooner or later, perhaps sooner rather than later, are going to win this war. So there is now the choice, discussed this many times in many programs, about either escalate to the point of potential uncontrolled disaster, as some people in Washington and London appear to want, or instead to negotiate for peace. And at the moment, some people seem to be coming to something like the same sort of conclusion, though as we will see when we talk about peace, they still harbour illusions about the form that this peace can take. Now, the article that tells us most clearly that the freeze idea is back on the agenda has appeared in Reuters, which is the main news agency in Britain. And it's couched as an exclusive. And it reads, exclusive, Putin wants ceasefire, Ukraine ceasefire on current front lines. And then, of course, then the article continues as follows. Russian President Vladimir Putin is ready to halt the war in Ukraine with a negotiated ceasefire that recognizes the current battlefield lines. 4 Russian sources told Reuters, saying he's prepared to fight on if Kiev and the West do not respond. 3 of the sources, familiar with discussions in Putin's entourage, said the veteran Russian leader had expressed frustration to a small group of advisors about what he views as Western-backed attempts to stymie negotiations and Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky's decision to rule out talks. Now, that second paragraph, in my opinion, immediately sets alarm bells ringing about the entire article. Firstly, we are told that the 3 of the sources are people who are familiar with discussions in Putin's entourage. Now, that tells us that they're not actually either members of the Russian government or people who have participated in any of these discussions themselves. The second point to make is that we are told that these people have disclosed to us a massive secret, which is that the veteran Russian leader, in other words Putin, had expressed frustration to a small group of advisors about what he views as Western-backed attempts to stymie negotiations and President Zelensky's decision to rule out talks. That, of course, is a mighty secret, a secret that Putin has been sharing in every single interview, statement, or discussion he makes about Ukraine and about the conflict in Ukraine with the entire world public. We do not need individuals familiar with private discussions in Putin's immediate circle to tell us that Putin is frustrated or has expressed frustration about the way in which the Western powers sabotaged the Istanbul negotiations, which is clearly what is being referred to here, because Putin has discussed this in many places, repeatedly and all the time. And we don't need to know, including, by the way, to an African Union delegation, where he actually waived the draft agreement to them, the Istanbul agreement to them, with the various with the various initials of the negotiators of each side. Anyway, we don't need private discussions, private informants to tell us about that, and we don't need either private informants to tell us that Putin has expressed frustration with President Zelensky's bizarre decision back in the autumn of 2022 to issue a decree which ruled out negotiations between Ukraine and Russia for so long as President Putin, remains in office. So already we see that the second paragraph of this article tells us that this isn't really an article based upon actual information that is coming out of the Russian government. It is, again, people from Reuters going out, talking to various people who they see as contacts. My guess is these are mostly business people or retired officials, and regurgitating their gossip, which is sometimes well informed, and, as in the case of the paragraph I've just described, based on things Putin has publicly said. Anyway, regurgitating all of that and passing it off as if it was secret information provided by people from the Russian government and in some way instigated perhaps by the Russian officials themselves. And we are nonetheless told that Putin can fight for as long as it takes, but Putin is also ready for a ceasefire to freeze the war, said another of the four. Though we are also then told that one of the officials, one of the people that they spoke to, one of the five, did not comment on freezing the war at the current front lines. Clearly, he knew nothing about this. Anyway, Reuters, these people who've written this article from Reuters, did at least take the precaution of bringing and discussing all of this with Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov. And Peskov basically reiterated fully all the standard positions that Russian officials and the Russian government has been taking all along, which is that Russia, of course, is prepared to negotiate. It's prepared to negotiate about the realities, but the initiative must come from the West, and that Russia is not going to plead for negotiations. And that's, I think, the origins of this article. It is not, I think, something that tells us much about the real thinking in Moscow. It is rather more about the kind of thinking and discussion that there might be about the future of the war that's taking place in Britain and the West. Now, there are other clues that the freeze idea is back, and there's an article today in The Guardian by the regular commentator they have there, Timothy Garton Ash. Timothy Garton Ash is a passionate supporter of Ukraine, but he has just come back from Ukraine. He's spoken to people in the military. He says that the mood in Ukraine is somber these days. The casualties keep mounting. In the military cemetery at Lvov, I see widows and bereaved mothers sitting silently beside the fresh graves of their loved ones, heads bowed, a life sentence of suffering etched on their faces. Medical experts estimate that at least half the population is suffering from some degree of post-traumatic stress disorder. I was not aware of that, by the way, and that is an important fact, and that gives us some idea of the incredible, the unbearable toll that this war is inflicting upon Ukraine, that half the population now is suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, and that he tells us that Vladimir Putin's forces are grinding forward using their numerical advantages and exploiting the slowness of the West to supply sufficient air defense and ammunition. And then he discusses the extraordinary difficulties that the Ukrainian military are facing, that they can't basically defend the entire front line. We're told that one Western military expert says this is a moment of jeopardy for Ukraine. And then we read that Major Andrei Pidlitsny, a battalion commander who's been on active service since the first days of the war, tells me the mood amongst his troops is not good. They think it's time for others to go and fight. And then Timothy Garton Ash goes on to say, but where are those others? A hotly contested law reducing the conscription age to 25 finally came into force last week. But wherever I turn, I hear stories of young Ukrainian men trying to just avoid the draft. And importantly, Timothy Garton Ash tells us that there is growing anger towards the West for not doing enough, fast enough to enable the country to defend itself. One senior government minister told me that the US Congress will never be forgiven by the Ukrainian people. All that, and but there's also criticisms that Timothy Garton Ash informs us are being made of Zelensky himself. These are the same criticisms that were discussed a few months ago in Time magazine. Anyway, this is how Timothy Garton Ash, a far more sympathetic journalist to Zelensky than the journalist who published that piece on Zelensky, that hit piece on Zelensky, in Time magazine at the end of last year. Anyway, this is what Timothy Garton Ash now tells us. One criticism I hear repeatedly is that Zelensky continues to feed unrealistic hopes of total victory, that is, the reconquest of all Ukraine's sovereign territory in its 1991 frontiers, including Crimea. Even senior officials privately give a more cautious definition of victory. Publicly, I support what the president says one to me. Unpublicly, I think we should survive as an independent Western state that has the possibility of development. And everyone is deeply worried about what Donald Trump will do if re-elected president of Ukraine, of the United States, on the 5th of November. And then he tells us that under pressure of terrible losses, exhaustion, trauma, and concerns about dwindling Western support, public opinion has shifted somewhat towards seeking peace. He says that Ukraine is on the ropes, and that Ukraine can't possibly defeat a larger opponent on its own. It needs more and bolder military support from the West right now, so it can put Putin on the ropes. Then and only then can Ukraine get to the point where it may achieve an outcome that a majority of its people will regard as victory and most Russians as defeat, which continues to be very much Timothy Garton Ash's desire. But he appears to concede that things might turn otherwise. He says that it's one thing to compromise over Crimea and the parts of Donbass occupied by Russia since 2014. Seems to concede that that might have to happen. But then he says quite another to sacrifice the vast swathes of Ukrainian land between the two, where, that is to say, the land bridge, Zaporozhye, Kherson, much more of Donbass, Kharkiv region, where some 2.5 million people had their homes and livelihoods before the full-scale invasion. The bigger the territorial compromise, the stronger would have to be the immediate Western guarantees of security and the more credible the prospect of EU and NATO membership in a not distant and uncertain future. So that is what Timothy Garton Ash clearly is hearing people say, that Ukraine is going to have to give up all the territory the Russians currently control, but it will still be able to join the EU and NATO. Now, all of these ideas are being floated. There's a very similar article, by the way, or at least an article, I won't say it's similar, but it makes some of the similar points, and it's been published by Seymour Hersh. And interestingly enough, his intelligence contacts are giving a rather more pessimistic view than they have previously done about the outcome of the war. Previously, they spoke about the state of the war being one of stalemate. Now we're told that the more likely outcome, if the war continues in the way that it is that it will end ultimately in Ukraine's total defeat. America, this is from Seymour Hersh, in the years Biden has been in office, has spent $175 billion to fight a war that cannot and will not be won. It will only be resolved by diplomacy if rationality prevails in Kiev and Washington, or else by the overwhelming defeat of the understaffed, undertrained and poorly equipped Ukrainian army. In recent weeks, I have been told, this is by his intelligence contacts, and this, by the way, is true, several Ukrainian combat brigades have not defected or considered doing so, but have made it known to their superiors that they will no longer participate in what would be a suicidal offensive against a better trained and better equipped Russian force. And the essential point about this article by Seymour Hersh is that the main obstacle to negotiations is not so much Zelensky, though he does come in for some criticism, but the president himself and his team. That the president has a Manichaean view of President Putin, that he thinks of him as some kind of dark angel, a death angel, someone who will try to trick you into believing he is a good person. In other words, the incarnate version of Lucifer. And that the president is joined in his hardline stance towards Russia by his two senior foreign policy aides, Secretary of State Antony Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, both of whom are masters of making self-serving leaks to friendly journalists. And then Seymour Hersh twists the knife where Blinken is concerned. Having failed a recent series of negotiations with Israel and Hamas to obtain a ceasefire and hostage releases in Gaza, Blinken returned last week from a visit to Ukraine with a recommendation, one that quickly was made public, that the White House should relax its current ban and, as the New York Times reported, expand the losing war by permitting the Ukrainian military to target missiles and artillery sites inside Russia. And the Times noted that the president and his aides believe that there is a red line that, if crossed, would unleash a strong reaction from Putin, although they do not know where or what that red line may be, nor do they know what the reaction might be. Such, concludes Hersh, is the haphazard state of the Biden administration's foreign policy. But then we go on to read that as for Putin, he is playing a long game. He secured Crimea and the 4 Ukrainian provinces, not entirely actually, and that he might be eyeing Kharkiv, which is his next prize. He's moving now for a checkmate on the city. But anyway, the long and the short of it again is that negotiations really need to happen. And again, though it's not spelled out in Seymour Hersh's article, one can see once again that the talk is of a freeze. Well, let's put aside what Reuters tells us Putin is thinking, and let's go to what Putin himself has told us. And like Ray McGovern and Patrick Armstrong, another tremendously erudite observer of the Russian scene, it is bewildering that people go to these murky sources to find out what Putin is thinking, when he has explained it all many times in many places. Anyway, let's see what Putin said most recently on this topic of negotiations to settle the conflict in Ukraine. Now, he said that just about 10 days ago in an interview he gave to the Chinese Xinhua news agency, and he said this: "We are seeking a comprehensive, sustainable and just settlement of this conflict through peaceful means. We are open to a dialogue on Ukraine, but such negotiations must take into account the interests of all countries involved in the conflict, including Russia's. They must also involve a substantive discussion on global stability and security for Russia's opponents, and naturally for Russia itself. Needless to say, these must be reliable guarantees." And other Russian officials, including in other places Putin himself, and by the way, Dmitry Peskov, in response to Reuters, have made clear that the status of the 4 regions is not negotiable, because on the basis of the Russian, because as far as the Russians are concerned, they are now part of Russian territory, and the question of their status and of their territorial extent is not negotiable either. So, we don't have to go to murky and mysterious sources to find out what the Russians actually want, but we can see that some people, again, looking at the military situation, aware of the fact that, as Timothy Garton-Ash tells us, Ukraine is on the ropes, that the mood in the army is bad, the Ukrainian army is bad, that they're being pushed back all along the line of control. Anyway, some people in the West are once again trying to revive the freeze idea. And this is consistent with an article we had a short time ago from the New York, I think it was in the New York Times, about some people in the Biden administration, again thinking of the Korea variant, an armistice along some kind of line, the Russians retaining control of what they already possess, Ukraine retaining control of the rest, being able to enter the NATO and the EU, and we can see from Timothy Garton-Ash's piece that there are some people within the Ukrainian government who are coming round to that idea also. Though we also see from Timothy Garton-Ash's piece that Zelensky himself, and by the way, his chief of staff, Andrei Yermak, continue to reject it outright. So there we go. That's the attempt again to get a freeze. There is nothing, no comment, no suggestion from any Russian official up to this point that gives us the slightest hint that the Russians are prepared to contemplate this freeze idea, one which they have repeatedly rejected outright, and which the Russians have already said is not only a non-starter, but which doesn't remotely satisfy the essential requirements that they set out, where Putin set out when the conflict started, which is the neutralization, demilitarization of Ukraine, the protection of Russian speakers, all of those things. And the Russian intelligence chief, Sergei Naryshkin, has now made further comments about these signals from the United States, the fact and from the West, these contradictory signals. Some people talking about a freeze of the conflict, others like Tony Blinken insisting that Ukraine must be allowed to launch missile strikes onto Russian territory. Naryshkin, as I said, Russia's intelligence chief, says mixed and often conflicting statements and assessments regarding developments in Ukraine are coming from the West. The reason is that Western elites are pretty much in disarray after realizing the fact that all the strategic initiative on the battlefield has passed to the Russian armed forces. After a year and a half of droning on, these are Naryshkin's words, about Russia's so-called strategic defeat on the battlefield, Western politicians find themselves in a different position today. So I don't believe there's going to be a freeze. I don't believe the Russians are in any mood to settle for anything like that. They've said so already. Putin wants to discuss the entire security architecture in Europe before there's peace in Ukraine. He's already said openly that there is not going to be a ceasefire whilst negotiations are underway. He said that the Western powers and the Ukrainians had tricked the Russians in the past. They tricked them, for example, over the question of the withdrawal of Russian troops from Kiev. They were told that this would facilitate the conclusion of the Istanbul peace agreement, when in fact it did the opposite. Putin has said repeatedly that Russia will not be caught out in something like that again. The Russians have made it quite clear that they're not interested in the freeze. The fact that the question of the freeze is being brought up again, exactly as Naryshkin says, is because the Russians are advancing. And as Timothy Garton-Ash rightly admits, Ukraine is on the rope, and as Seymour Hersh also says, the Ukraine's understaffed, undertrained, and poorly equipped army is now facing an overwhelming defeat. So, what is happening on the battlefronts, and what is the actual situation at the moment? Well, I should say that the first thing that I heard when I checked up the updates this morning is that there's been another major Ukrainian missile strike on Crimea. The Ukrainians are claiming, perhaps correctly, that they destroyed a radar a big radar station that had been built by the Soviet Union in Crimea as part of its space program. Now, undoubtedly, this radar system exists. I have to say that I had heard some time ago that it was non-operational. Now, that may or may not be true. It might be that it had been brought back into operations, but that, or it may be that it was non-operational. And of course, I don't know for a fact even that it has been destroyed. But what is indisputable is that this missile strike did take place. The Russians are again claiming that they've shot down large numbers of ATACMS missiles. The story every day now is of more and more ATACMS missiles, which the Russians are claiming that they've shot down. Again, I can't obviously corroborate these claims, but it's plausible that they are true, given the numbers of ATACMS missiles that Ukraine has now launched at Russia, which must be now hovering around 50 to 60. It does seem to me overall that there's been surprisingly little to show so far for the effect of these missiles. Maybe they will become more effective as time passes. But anyway, there was a big missile strike by Ukraine on Crimea. There has been also a perhaps retaliatory missile strike by the Russians on Ukrainian positions around Odessa. Again, I have very little information about this. This sort of thing goes on all the time. It seems to me that there is a kind of missile war going on between the Russians striking at Odessa and the Ukrainians striking at Crimea. Each side tries to parry to the best extent it can the other's moves. Nearly all the Russian missiles get through because Ukraine's air defenses, as everybody admits, are in tatters. Only a small proportion of Ukraine's missiles launched at Crimea get through. They do some damage, but I think the damage that they're doing so far is limited. Elsewhere on the front lines, the news is bad. Now, bad for Ukraine. Now, I ought to say that there are contradictory things about the situation in Volchansk. Yesterday, it was confirmed that there are still Ukrainian troops north of the Volcha River in some parts of, it's particularly occupying a residential complex of high rises and an industrial area close to the Volcha River. To me, that force appears to be cut off, as I discussed in my program yesterday. But perhaps in response to the revelation that there are troops, Ukrainian troops, still in Volchansk, north of the Volcha River, some of the mappers, Suryak, for example, have now colored in a significant part of Volchansk north of the Volcha River, which they previously assigned to the Russians. They've colored it back and have suggested that it is in fact the Ukrainians who actually control this territory. Well, even as they were doing that, we've had a report, again, I'm taking this from TASS, which suggests that, on the contrary, Ukraine is losing ground in Volchansk. Now, this is not a report from a Telegram channel. It is a report published by TASS, and it says this: Russian forces currently control more than half of the territory of Volchansk, a city in Kharkiv region, State Duma lawmaker Viktor Vodolatsky told TASS. The territory under Russian control has grown and currently exceeds 50%. We are advancing carefully but steadily. Russian troops are successfully fulfilling their objectives. Putting aside small population localities, which we are liberating on the way, it means all these various villages that we've talked about in many places, Klashayevka, Andreevka in the Bakhmut region, all of these places. He goes on to say, which we are liberating on the way. Our next goal is Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and Krasnoarmeysk. And Krasnoarmeysk is the Russian name for the town, about 50,000 people, known as Pakrovsk. The Ukrainians call Pakrovsk, and which for the moment, at least, I will continue to refer to as Pakrovsk. And then Volodyatsky added that the liberation of Volchansk will open the way to these cities, not obviously to Pakrovsk, which is located far away from these places, but ultimately for liberation of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation. I've explained that of the two places that are being fought over at the moment in Kharkiv region, Lipsy and Volchansk. In my opinion, it is Volchansk that is the more important. Lipsy lies on the way to Kharkiv, and if the Russians do have plans eventually for Kharkiv, no doubt they will want to capture it. In fact, I'm sure they will want to capture it in time. But for the moment, the priority is to take Volchansk, because Volchansk affects the state of the fighting in Kupiansk and southern Kharkiv region. If the Russians are able to capture Volchansk, then that enables them to start disorganizing the Ukrainian supply routes to Kupiansk, and that will facilitate the Russian offensive towards Kupiansk and the recapture of places like Izium, which will then put the Russians in a strong position to attack Slavyansk from the north. And of course, Volodyatsky talks about Kramatorsk, which is the southern spur of the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation. And that again makes a great deal of sense. It's related to the ongoing fighting in Chasiv Yar. The Russians, as of the time of making of this program, continue to storm the micro-district east of the canal. There are still uncertainties, at least as far as I'm concerned, there are uncertainties about whether the Russians have or have not established a presence west of what I will continue to refer to as the canal, though, as I said, it's really a set of large pipelines. Anyway, whether or not the Russians have indeed established a presence west of this area and have created for themselves a bridgehead around in another micro-district to the south of the main part of Chasiv Yar, which is called Novi. But anyway, one way or the other, the Russians are continuing the battle for Slavyansk, for Chasiv Yar, and of course they've just captured Klishevka and Andreevka. They've just retaken control of those two villages. There are reports that they're now gradually advancing westwards. They will reach the area of the canal in this area again fairly soon, and before long they'll be able to cross the canal there as well, and will be able to launch further attacks on Chasiv Yar from the south and from all sorts of directions. And they might also, as I've discussed in an earlier program, if they cross the canal in this area, they might conceivably also launch advances to the southwest as well. But I'm not going to discuss that in detail here in this program now. But anyway, that fighting continues. And of course, the point about Chasiv Yar, as Volodyatsky might have told us, but as he hasn't done, is that once Chasiv Yar falls, and with the Russians apparently also now preparing for an attack somewhat to the north of Chasiv Yar on a village known as Orekhovo-Vasilyevka, which have been close to for some time. Well, the way then opens for an attack on Kramatorsk. So the two parts of the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation subject to potential attack from two directions. Slavyansk could be attacked from the north and, by the way, also from the east. Russians have recently announced the capture of Belogorovka. Still apparently fighting going on close to Belogorovka, but I've no doubt that the Russians are in control of that village. The Russians have recently captured Belogorovka. They're probably likely to capture Siversk, or at least try to capture Siversk fairly soon. And when I say fairly soon, obviously this is a process of weeks, months maybe. And perhaps also Russian advances along the Oskol and Zherebets river lines suggest an attack eventually towards Liman, also opening the way. These attacks on Slavyansk and Liman also opening the way for an attack on Slavyansk from the east. So one could see how the ground is being prepared for a Russian offensive, perhaps in the autumn towards Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. What I suspect is going to be the biggest battle of all in the war up to now. The Ukrainians, if they want to hold on to any part of Donbass at all, will try to defend bitterly these two cities. And of course, if Slavyansk and Kramatorsk fall, then not only are the Russians in complete control of the whole of northern and central Donbass, but as far as I could see, they have a clear way, a clear pathway going forward all the way to the Dnieper in areas not far from Kiev itself. Anyway, that's one titanic battle which I suspect is looming on the horizon. The other battle, perhaps of a rather lesser magnitude, but is also coming, or so it seems to me. In the south of Donbass, we've heard reports now that the Russians are actually doing what the Ukrainian soldiers in this village of Krasnogorovka were warning apparently the Ukrainian command that they would do, which is that they're now moving to encircle the remaining Ukrainian troops holed up in the northwestern part of Krasnogorovka. The Russians appear to be advancing now through the fields, aiming to cut off the communications to this military force that is still clinging on to the northwest of Krasnogorovka. So Krasnogorovka, remaining Ukrainian troops there gradually being encircled, and the 79th Brigade of the Ukrainian military has told us that the Russians now control half of the village of Paraskovyevka and are likely soon to capture the remainder, and that the Russians are advancing to the south of the other village of Konstantinovka and are probably likely to begin storming this village too. And with Krasnogorovka falling, with the Russians apparently in virtual control of Georgievka, the battle for Kurakhovo about to begin, the battle for Vuglidar probably likely to start. These are relatively small places, but they're important fortified places. And then once that's done, with the Russians now having broken the Ukrainian defense lines along the Netailovo, Umanske area, with the virtual capture of these two villages, and with the Russians now beginning the storming of the village of Novo-Alexandrovka to the northwest of Ocheretino, the Russians are well positioned, again probably in the autumn, to begin their offensive. Their siege of Pokrovsk, the town that Volodyatsky calls Krasnoarmeysk, the third of the towns that he refers to. After which, if all of these places are captured by the Russians this year, then I think it's important to say, again, that the main part of the war will have ended. There is no other part of Ukraine that reproduces the difficult geography of the Donbass, the muddy soil, the intricate network of small rivers and canals, the density, the dense web of industrial villages and small towns and factories. There's nowhere else in Ukraine that reproduces this topography so closely, with Donbass having been brought under control, with the Russians only a limited distance from the river, the Dnieper. Once the Russians arrive on the eastern bank of the Dnieper in central Ukraine, then, as I said, it's essentially game over. I'm not saying the war would end immediately if the Ukrainians chose to keep fighting, which perhaps they would. There would still be many months, perhaps a whole year of fighting still to go. But Ukraine would no longer be a viable country within its existing borders. And it wouldn't just be eastern Ukraine, which Ukraine would stand to lose. It would be the central regions of Ukraine also, if the war were prolonged further. I've explained the reasons for this in many programs, the facts of economic geography that effectively dictate that outcome. I'm not going to repeat them in this program today. So, we see why Western leaders are now talking again about a freeze of the conflict in Ukraine, or at least some Western leaders are. Not all Western leaders. Tony Blinken, Joe Biden, Jake Sullivan, they want to continue the war. Tony Blinken wants to authorize the Ukrainians to launch missiles and other things at Russian territory with permission and help from the United States. I've already said that it's likely that one of the targets that the Ukrainians will aim for are Russian nuclear power stations. And it's one thing, as I said, to attack these power stations with drones, small drones, which have achieved nothing. It is a very different thing to try to strike at them with ATACMS missiles. Those could do substantial damage. We will see whether the United States goes along with that. If anything like that happens, as I've said already, the Russians will respond, and they could respond against American assets in any part of the world, at which point the whole conflict could start to go global in all kinds of uncontrollable ways. So there are hardliners as well. In fact, I would say that the hardliners, on balance, remain very much in the ascendant. But it is interesting that, again, as Narishkin says, the Western governments, or some people within the Western governments, within the Western political and media space, are again talking about and discussing a possible way out, a settlement freeze, a freeze of the conflict in some form, one which would preserve part of Ukraine, but which principally, of course, would help them save face, which is what this is now all about, even as they would plan for new adventures against the Russians in future. Well, that's all very interesting, but I would say that there is also another reason for these discussions, because as Project Ukraine now clearly moves towards failure, even people like Timothy Garton-Ash coming back from Ukraine can see this. Even as Project Ukraine moves towards failure, another group of people, the China hawks, are starting to reassert themselves. I want to go back to that absolutely critically important article that Ray McGovern published in Consortium News and elsewhere. It goes back to a discussion that happened in the early weeks of the Biden administration. At that time also, there was a discussion, as I well remember, which played out in the media, not the media that most people read, but the specialist media written for the foreign policy and defense and security people that people in Washington read. Anyway, that specialist media, there was a discussion that played out in the specialist media between the China hawks and the Russia hawks. The China hawks, and I remember there was a strong piece about this which appeared in the website of the Atlantic Council, no less. The China hawks said that the major challenge to the United States is not Russia, but China. The United States needs to focus on China, and it should therefore work to try to detach Russia from China, even if that meant making some concessions to Russia in Europe. And a few weeks after that, a meeting happened in Geneva, the only summit meeting, proper summit meeting, that's taken place between Biden and Putin over the course of this administration. And Ray McGovern says, and I think on this he is absolutely right, that the main purpose of this meeting, from the administration's point of view, was to try to persuade Putin and Russia to break with China, to distance themselves from China. And we had all sorts of blurted comments by Biden when the meeting ended, talking about the danger for Russia if it got too close to China, saying that the Russians needed to be worried and perhaps were even worried about China. And it's clear that at the meeting itself in Geneva, Putin was not prepared to make any concession on the relationship with China at all. And as Ray McGovern also says, what then happened over the course of the rest of 2021 is that the Chinese and the Russians, Xi Jinping and Putin, went out of their way in various statements and through various meetings to make clear that the Chinese-Russian relationship was not up for negotiation. It was inviolable. And it was probably this that triggered the swerve in policy in Washington. The article by Wes Mitchell, which I discussed so many times, appeared in August 2021 in the National Interest. The one, in other words, a few weeks after the Geneva summit, the one which said that what the US needed to do was to engineer Russia's defeat in Ukraine so that the United States could capture control of Russian foreign policy and redirect it against China. And then, of course, a few months later, we got a war in Ukraine, an outright conflict in Ukraine. But of course, instead of Russia being defeated. It is instead winning. It is moving towards what Seymour Hersh says is an outright victory. Or at least I should say more correctly what Seymour Hersh's sources, his informants in the intelligence community are telling him is an outright victory. So, the China hawks, they've looked at all of this. They've said to people like Blinken and Sullivan, well, obviously not directly, but the discussion is, well, this strategy really hasn't worked out. We've got to start thinking about China again. And that means that we've got to find some means to disentangle ourselves from Europe, because we cannot be strong both in Europe and in Asia at one and the same time. Our resources are finite, and we have to scale down in Europe. And these people are back, and today one of them has an article in the Financial Times, and he's Elbridge Colby, and we read that Elbridge Colby is a former official of the United States. The writer is a principal at the Marathon Initiative and served as Pentagon lead for the 2018 National Defense Strategy. Now, I don't have any idea what the Marathon Institute is, but we have an infinite number of these think tanks floating around Washington, all of them financed to a greater or lesser extent by the military-industrial complex. The key thing is that he's clearly a well-connected official, and we learn that he was Pentagon lead for the 2018 National Defense Strategy. So he's clearly a former Pentagon official and a senior one. And he writes for a European audience in the Financial Times as follows: "It is increasingly common to hear from Americans that we must focus more on China and Asia and less on Europe. Unsurprisingly, this perspective is not always welcomed. Commentators often charge that such counsel is rooted in isolationism, weakness, or the personal agendas of given leaders." Personal agendas of given leaders might be, by the way, a reference to Donald Trump. I don't know. And then he goes on to say, it is not. It is rooted in deep structural realities. The fact is that the United States will have to prioritize China and Asia over Europe in the coming years, regardless of who is in charge. The primacy of Asia and the rise of a superpower, China, compel it. And he goes on to say that many opponents of a refocus to Asia like to wrap themselves in the legacy of the Cold War. But while the logic of Cold War strategy, namely to prevent any potential hostile power from dominating the most important industrialized region of the world, used to lead America to Europe, today it indicates America must concentrate on Asia. And then he talks about the enormous growth of Chinese power. He says that China's manufacturing base is now bigger than the US, that its military is growing at what he says is a breathtaking pace. He says that there are uncertainties about Chinese policy, but that China is working to sanction-proof its economy and is conditioning its population to be ready for stormy weather ahead. He says that the United States ought to try to deter China from going to war with the for example, by undertaking a successful invasion of Taiwan or any other ally in Asia. And of course, people like the writer of this article are very well aware that even as I'm writing this, a massive Chinese exercise is underway around Taiwan, with the Chinese Navy openly rehearsing a blockade of Taiwan. Anyway, he writes all about this, but he then goes on to say that despite the fact that China is rising, Asia is rising, China is the main challenger to the United States today, some people still live in illusions that the United States can deter both China and Russia at the same time. Many will concede this, but say America should still be able to provide the bulk of the defense for its allies in both Asia and Europe. But this is simply not realistic. It is a fact that the United States does not have a military large enough or appropriately designed to fight two major wars, especially should fighting break out simultaneously with China and Russia. And he says there is very significant overlap between the needs for a fight over Taiwan and one in Europe, not enough resources to go round, and an urgent demand for the US to make up lost ground in Asia. These deficits cannot be remedied quickly or easily. So what is the right strategic response? Despite stirring rhetoric from leaders in Congress and the press, a foreign policy of US primacy is simply not possible. We do not have the military for it, and even if the budget were available, we could not field one in sufficient time. Meanwhile, there is growing concern about the size of US deficits, and many are warning about increasing our already high debt load. So he says that pulling back to our own shores and allowing the chips to fall is not an option. That would lead to Chinese-dominated Asia, with grave consequences for the American economy. The answer lies between these two extremes in strategic prioritization and grappling with the reality of scarcity and the need for hard choices, focusing resources and willpower where the United States' most important interests are endangered in Asia. And then, of course, he does cast a comfort blanket over the Europeans. He says that doesn't mean abandoning Europe. What it means is that the Europeans must take over responsibility for their own defense. And in other words, a major pullback and drawdown of US forces from Europe, with the Europeans stepping in, increasing their defense budgets, taking the steps by themselves to defend themselves from an ascendant Russia. And he admits this will involve vulnerabilities. The US must withhold forces from Europe that may be needed in Asia, even in the event of Russia attacking first. This is because if the US ties down or loses key forces for a defense of Taiwan in a less significant European fight, it is asking for China to attack. Well, some years ago, when we first started the Duran, I wrote a number of pieces on our website pointing out to this very thing. I said that the United States is at risk soon of facing an overcommitments crisis. I did programs to that effect when we started the Duran channel, and when I started this channel also. I said that sooner or later, the United States is going to have to start making choices. It's going to have to decide what it does it cannot be strong everywhere, all at once. Its utterly catastrophic diplomacy has created a situation where it is in conflict with two superpowers instead of one. Its resources are not equal to that, all the more so given that it's also taken upon itself all sorts of commitments in the Middle East, where it is also facing an intractable and costly situation. So, interestingly enough, this person, Mr. Elbridge Colby, is very careful not to mention the word Ukraine in any part of this article. But it's not difficult to see through it, and I'm no doubt at all that he does represent an influential body of opinion within the Pentagon. Basically, what he's saying is, Project Ukraine has failed. Project Break Up Russia has also failed. All that the administration has been trying to do in Europe has ended up in disaster. All that's been achieved is that Russia has become much more powerful. It's remilitarizing, it's rebuilding its military at a pace that we simply cannot keep up with. But we've got to look at our strategic interests. We must pull back from Europe, abandon Project Ukraine, focus on China instead. And of course, when I say abandon Project Ukraine, I don't mean that Mr. Colby or anyone else in the American political leadership says just cut and run, though it might eventually come to that. What these people are saying is try and find some way out. Talk to the Russians, speak to Putin, see whether you can agree this freeze idea, because there is really no choice. That is what we have to do. Otherwise, we're going to face a situation where our entire position in Asia will begin to collapse. Now, I ought to say that if you go to the thread of this article on the Financial Times, you will see all sorts of European respondents, and they're furious about this. They're horrified by the implications of what is set out in this article. And I'm also going to say something. I think that European governments have been aware of this for a long time, and they've been worried that this is the drift of US policy away from Europe and towards Asia. And I think that when we read articles and commentaries in European newspapers talking about the threat of Donald Trump, what they're really referring to is the threat, at least as the Europeans perceive it, of thinking like this. Now, there is, of course, the obstacle, which is the president himself and his officials. And I'm going to go back to Seymour Hersh's article, because one of the points about this article that Seymour Hersh has published, which is important to remember, is drawn from his sources, Hersh's sources in the intelligence community, is the utter exasperation of some people within the US government at the president's fixation with Russia. And he says, this is Seymour Hersh, it is easy for an American to dislike Putin. I have turned down, and he talks about who puts reporters in jail and tolerates no significant political opposition, including the assassination of his enemies. Well, I'm not going to discuss that paragraph. Much could be said about it. And then he says that There are those in the American intelligence community who, however, believe that America bears its own responsibility for the war in Ukraine, the whole project of bringing Ukraine into NATO. But then the point is this. One long-time senior American official stunned me recently, saying he's concluded that Biden sees Putin as a death angel. Someone, the official explained, who will try to trick you into believing he's a good person. Biden is joined in his hardline stance towards Russia by his two senior foreign policy aides, Secretary Blinken and National Security Advisor Sullivan. And the point is that they won't talk to Putin. President Biden's advanced age and the difficulty he has getting through his speech aren't the only things putting his re-election at risk. Another liability is his long-standing inability to see the world as it is. He has made no effort since Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022 to arrange a one-on-one meeting with Vladimir Putin, Russia's president. And in other words, he's not prepared to talk. Now, what to conclude from all of this? As I said, there are some people who want a settlement freeze. I think that the people in the Pentagon I've been talking about, who've always been there, are perhaps now demanding it more loudly than they have in the past. But it looks to me as if they're beginning to see beyond President Biden. They've, I think, perhaps come to the conclusion that this president is never going to change his policy. He remains stuck in Cold War thinking. He is fixated with Putin and with Russia, and he's blind to the real threat, which all of these people believe in, which is, of course, China. And I have to say this, I suspect that this time, in this forthcoming election, it is not impossible that part of America's national security state, the people who think in the way that this article in the Financial Times, and who've leaked these comments to Seymour Hersh, and who might be behind even the Reuters story, that these people might say to themselves, well, eccentric a personality as Donald Trump is, at least he has a better understanding of strategic realities than Biden has, and at least we can talk these things over with him in a way that talking over them with Biden is all but impossible. So this might have an impact on the election itself. Notice how the Seymour Hersh article implies that it will. President Biden's age and difficulties aren't the only things putting his re-election at risk. Another liability is his long-standing inability to see the world as it is. Anyway, all very interesting, but it's important to stress that for the moment, the Russians continue their advance in Ukraine. Narishin's comments that I spoke about before about the disarray in the West shows that the Russians are aware of all of this and perhaps taking note of it, but it is not going to in any way affect their strategic choices. And as for the freeze idea, well, Peskov has all but already told Reuters that this is a non-starter. We shall see where all this goes. But let me make, before I finish, one quick further point, which is that in my opinion, prioritizing China and Asia over Russia and Europe is indeed a false choice. I think that what some people in Washington and the Pentagon are talking about is, well, a possible future war with China is more important than a possible future war with Russia in Europe. So we've got to focus on China because China is the alternative superpower, and we must therefore challenge it in Asia, and that's why we have to scale back in Europe. I don't think this is correct thinking at all. I think the correct thinking is completely different. I think it is to seek peace with both countries. I think both China and Russia would be prepared to negotiate and to come to some kind of agreement with the United States. The Chinese have their concerns about Taiwan, which the United States has shown an astonishing and utterly reckless disregard for. And of course, they also have their sensitivities about the South China Sea, about which you can say exactly the same. But I do not think that China has any desire to get involved in a military conflict with the United States, and Chinese leaders go out of their way repeatedly, including Xi Jinping, to say that what China and the United States needs is a win-win relationship. They need to stabilize their relations, they need to establish proper, secure guardrails, and that they should work jointly towards that objective. And as for the Russians, let me go back to what that article, that interview that Putin gave to Xinhua says. Putin said, "We're seeking a comprehensive, sustainable, and just settlement of this conflict through peaceful means. We are open to dialogue on Ukraine, but such negotiations must take into account the interests of all countries involved in the conflict, including Russia's. They must include a substantive discussion on global stability and security guarantees for Russia's opponents and naturally for Russia itself. Needless to say, these must be reliable guarantees." The Russians, in other words, do not want to conquer Europe. They do not want to oust the United States from its primacy. They know perfectly well that is way beyond their power, and why anyway would it be in their interests to do that? What they want is security in their own space, which of course includes Ukraine. And that has to extend to a reconsideration, a reconstruction of the security architecture in Europe, which, by the way, going back to Mr. Colby's article, would be in US interests, since, of course, it would also reduce US commitments to Europe, which, as we have seen in the war in Ukraine, risk becoming a massive drain on limited US resources, and which, as we have also repeatedly seen in terms of the conflict in Ukraine, also risk involving the United States in apocalyptic scenarios, which in its own interests it should do its best to avoid. This is very obvious to me. It's very obvious to all, I think, sane people. I do not understand why it is so difficult for so many people to understand it. At least in the United States, we are starting to see some political leaders like J.D. Vance, for example, starting to make these points, and that is a good sign. In Europe, we're far behind that point, it must be said. But this debate needs to be broadened beyond a discussion of if we can't defeat Russia, we must prioritize China. This is in itself a dead end. We must get past that. But in the meantime, putting all that to one side, we need to see that once again, this discussion about the future of Project Ukraine is flaring up again. And there are some people who, while they're not looking for peace, are starting to look for a way out without having any real idea of how they're going to do it, even as Russia's armies continue their forward march. Well, that's my program for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our various programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can also find you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop where you can find all the amazing things we have, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.